here to talk about policy making, I guess, from my perspective. I'm from DQ, as Climate Change, Energy, the Environment Board, to the Commonwealth Department. And the discussion that we just had, that panel we just had, just shows the importance of the integration of all those policy ideas, I guess. And, one of the reasons that we're all together in that Commonwealth Department is to try and have all these matters considered at the same time. One of the jobs of my branch, the National Law Policy International and Engagement branch, is to try and influence and talk to the rest of the department about the important policy matters they're progressing and the impact on water and the requirements of those initiatives of water, so that we're thinking about those things in a joined up way. But it really is very complex and difficult. And lots of reasons for that. I also had international water in my branch, and that's one of the reasons that we have this wonderful partnership with AWP and DFAT. We've got some MOUs with Indonesia and India. We oversee our SDG 6 reporting obligations for Australia, and we have other international leadership goals for water. So we're just coming out of caretaker, as you'd all be aware. So we don't have a minister yet for water. And so I'm using this time just to reflect on some recent work we've been doing around renewing our National Water Initiative, which is the responsibility that I had in my ranch. And the way that we've worked with people and community on trying to engage on the development of that policy. Okay. So there's lots of things that I think we've just been talking a lot about how complex it is making a difference in water management. And it's the same in Australia. There's lots of levels of government that are involved in water management. The state and territory governments are responsible for managing water in their states primarily. And the Australian government provides a national coordination and leadership role. I've also got local governments, and there's a number of other parties which are really influential and important in water management. Utilities, we talked about that earlier, private companies, universities, research organisations, not-for-profit organisations, lobby groups. And of course, there's people at the end of all of this who need the water and rely on water. This means it's a very complex policy space to work in. And in the Commonwealth, we have limited levers in some ways. So the context for Australia is we have a dry climate. And this is one of the reasons that we have such engaged stakeholders as well, because we live on this dry continent. Surface water is our primary water source here, and this leaves us very vulnerable to water-related disasters such as droughts. The demands are growing on water with the changes that are coming. Water is a solution. Mitigation and action rely on water. Water is an issue in its own. But in the past, we've had drought, which has been a big driver, a powerful accelerator in our water policy reform. The Millennium Drought in particular really kicked things off in the way that Australia has started seeing the influence of joining up by our governments. This shows a little bit about the history of water reform in Australia. And we have had an initiative called still has an initiative called the National Water Initiative, which is an intergovernmental agreement. It was driven by the Commonwealth to develop it at the time, and agreed by all states and territories. Now, this is an overarching policy framework. It's not a law, but it did inform a lot of laws and practices and frameworks and policies across the Commonwealth as well as across state and territory governments. And it is a way of wrapping up a lot of the work around water and the balancing around water needs. And this was signed in 2004, so quite a long time ago, informed these laws here and many others. It was basically a framework in principles. It's quite a complicated document, but also high level. It aimed to make Australia's water use more efficient, provided investment confidence and certainty for the environment, improved water security, set up water markets, setting out water for the environment, and at the time, some of this was quite groundbreaking. And as I said, it's really powerful because it's informed the way that water practices in Australia have evolved. But it is quite old, and it's been identified for a number of years that a new water agreement is needed. The Productivity Commission has put out inquiries into the National Water Initiative from 2017 every 3 years and set really clear scope for improvements. Some of their key recommendations are laid out here. And the one that's probably most important for this presentation is around increasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander involvement and influence in water resource management. There are lots of improvements that are required, but that's the one, I guess, that this presentation mostly focuses on. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's water interest was not well considered in the 2004 agreement. But it's an enormous task to balance all the stakeholders' needs when you're developing a policy like this, and especially as those needs are increasing, and we don't really have a handle exactly on what they're going to be in the future. We wanted a great which would set out an approach, and maybe last for another 20 years to come. So what we're really talking about here is how do we work together across all these governments, and governance has been very important and something that actually is close to my heart, talked about earlier. So we needed to set up some really good structures around the way we're talking about policy reform around water and making that overarching coordination. So this is a simple diagram that shows that we have a committee structure across levels of government to progress water reform. The National Water Committee was established in 2019 when the Commonwealth committed to working on the National Water Initiative and updating it. And the year after, the box on the side, the Committee for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Water Interests was established, which is an advisory body. Underneath these committee structures are subcommittees. They are technical subcommittees, but are made up of state and territory officials, as is the National Water Committee, which is a high-level senior officials group. And then these groups all feed up to provide advice to the Water Ministerial Council, which is obviously water ministers from state and territories and the Commonwealth. Then a NWI working group was also established, and this is a group that has basically led the drafting of the agreement. So we're working on a new national water agreement, and what's really important in this diagram is the key role that the COWI, the Committee on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Water Interests, has played in providing advice into government. And this framework has ensured that we have access to expertise required to develop an agreement that addresses technical issues, looks to the future, takes advice from one of the key stakeholders for this work, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but also takes everybody on a journey in the key signatories to the agreement. We were all working together to drive the way this agreement was drafted. And, trust between the parties is crucial to the success of the agreement. So we've done a lot of consultation along the way, as what this slide is showing. It was a nationally coordinated and jurisdictionally led approach is what we call it. So we did it all together and we did it separately, but we used the same messages as we did it separately. So the Commonwealth coordinated the engagement. We made consultations. We drove really the consultation tools and materials, but in concert with all the states and territories, and advised by COWI to make sure that we were consulting with, bodies that were well funded. We were consulting with bodies that are well established, and then we also wanted to consult with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's bodies. And so we had COWI to help us with how to do that, different type of engagement. The Commonwealth led engagement with the national organisations, and the states and territories led engagement in their jurisdictions. The Commonwealth led the engagement on COWI's behalf as well. But COWI's processes and tools also fed into the state and territory engagement. So we did. We had sort of papers, we had submissions, we had webinars, and we had roundtables. And we also catered the agreement from the top down. What are the big things that are most important to communities? Then we tried to sort of see, how will we get to those? And then we put in some of the more detailed practices underneath. So each time we went out to people with proposals, we worked down a different level of detail. So why did we do all of this? And why is the focus so clearly on at this presentation anyway, my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander water interests. In Australia, First Nations people own and control less than 0.2% of the water, comparatively to 16% of land. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander individuals have managed water holistically 65,000 years, and they have a lot of expertise in managing water. But since colonisation, they've been excluded from decision-making about water. Free flow and access to water is directly linked to the well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. In the NWI, there was a real gap in how First Nations people's cultural knowledge can inform decision-making, and there was no real mechanism for them to be involved in it either. First Nations people's perspective of cultural knowledge can and should inform practices that honour their custodial role and contribute to sustainable water practices. Their deep history in managing water can teach us a lot. We need to have a framework that encourages and allows that knowledge. To make the agreement do this, we need to have consultation with First Nations communities of people to make sure the policy developed is inclusive and is about true partnership, respect and co-design. This scan thing will take you to an insights paper that Taylor developed, which is around how to have shared conversations and good understanding about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's water interests and values. And I suggest to have a look at it if you're consulting or talking with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or communities. This is a great resource, particularly for big organisations. It's sort of like a bit of a how-to guide and things to consider. So this slide's just showing some of the reasons that we think that First Nations engagement is important and matters. Australian governments are committed to changing the status quo. And as I said, this actually building a policy that can do that starts with genuinely collaborating with First Nations people from the beginning in the development of an inclusive water agreement. And the strengths that we see in the way we put our governance structure, which is enduring, is that we have the Committee of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples at the table. They're in the working groups, the subcommittees that sit underneath. They're being at the working group, doing the drafting. They're providing advice to the senior officials making a decision. So at NWC, and they also attend to the Water Ministerial Council and present at that as well. So their voices are heard in this way. Baking them into the governance structure is, we think, an effective way to keep them at the table. True collaboration should have a significant improved outcomes for Australia. And it's been a really special process working closely with them and learning a lot about their water interests and how it affects them in a cultural, spiritual, social, economic and environmental way. Which, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are all interconnected. So as I said earlier, intergovernmental agreements are not legally binding or enforceable in the way that legislation or as a contract is. The Commonwealth doesn't have a huge amount of power when it comes to water management. We do have some laws that where we do, but in the main, we rely on our relationships with state and territory governments, local governments, and these sort of framework pieces to try and get this consistency and improvement and uplift in water management. And these intergovernmental agreements express our joint commitments of governments to work together towards shared goals. The consultation and taking the community along and hearing people about what water is for them is a really important part of water reform and continuing water reform. And it's not about making the policy the new national water agreement and leaving it there. It's about how do we continue. So in the construct of the agreement, we have mapped out a pathway to continue to consult with people all the way along. So the intergovernmental agreement itself will be a high-level document, relatively, the complexity of water. But for us, I guess it's a high-level document because it has to appreciate that water management in all the different states and territories is actually done really differently. And so it looks to do that. Each jurisdiction will have an action plan, and in the development of an action plan, there's baked-in consultation there. So they will be engaging with community at a jurisdiction level, including to develop actions that sit under the agreement and support the implementation of the agreement. The Water Ministerial Council will oversee the implementation of the agreement, but as part of that, the action plans will be reported on. The action plans will be made public, reported on annually, and those will be made public, and then reported on every 3 to 5 years ongoing, and it will also be made public. So as part of that, the community of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander vehicles will continue to be involved in the monitoring and evaluation when it comes to, in particular, the concepts in the one of the objectives in the agreement is specific to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for interests, but also more broadly using other more traditional methods for assessing water quality, for instance. So I think that's it. Thanks again for the opportunity to share what we've been doing in the Commonwealth to lift this inclusive policy. We are really interested in genuine partnerships. We worked with Lovi here in our international space and hope to do so also in the further development and implementation of the National Water Agreement. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I've got down a couple of questions. Angie just has a couple of minutes, so a couple of questions,
Thank you, Vanilla. That was great to see. And the process has been really consultative and lots of people have been engaged in it. So I'm excited about what the project looks like at the end of the document or look like. My question is around the buy-in, though, and there's an old saying, never get between a premier and a bucket of money. And the challenge that we have with these kind of national agreements is who's going to fund it at the end of the day. And that's going to determine how much buy-in there is to the actual new agreement. Having been the chair of the National Water Commission, as it was expired by a previous government, I know that the states are not interested in having more obligations and it costs them more money that they don't have a pathway in the financially constrained environment to fund. So perhaps you could give us some, the thinking around there.
Absolutely. We have thought about this a lot, and you were right. There's the buy is obviously very important. The way that we're seeing it from the Commonwealth perspective is that once we have a signed agreement, that our Commonwealth funding, of which there is a lot of it, will be shaped by the priorities of this new agreement. So over time, that's the influence that we will have. We don't get a specific funding bucket to implement this agreement, but all the work that we do across Australia should go in the direction of the priorities in this agreement. And so, so in that way, our programs of work, in the same way that the National Water Initiative did shape all the policies and frameworks over, great long period of time, 20 years, well, this new agreement will do the same thing. I don't underestimate how difficult it is. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Look, this is a variation of that question. I think that the phase before prior to the National Water Initiative, the Commonwealth had very specific microeconomic reform objectives in terms of how it wanted the states to manage water, including urban water. And it didn't fund it so much as it actually provided financial incentives. So if you achieve this, we will pay you. And back to the point, don't get between a premier and bucket of money. It was incredibly incentivized. It worked. State treasuries got involved in driving their water counterparts to get on the program. Does the Commonwealth have any overarching imperatives that it wishes to achieve through this National Water Initiative? I think you've answered the question that there won't be specific incentives, but the Commonwealth there was really clear about what it was trying to achieve. Are there highlights in this process about what the Commonwealth wants from?
Yeah, look, there have been some new sort of areas of focus. I don't know if there's anything as specific as what you're describing. Certainly, obviously, the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples was certainly one of them. I think some of the other things that we've been focused on as we've gone is the way that water infrastructure is invested and saying decisions are made around that. And probably the coordinated use of science and data and cultural information has been another way, and trying to sort of ensure that the way the water decisions are made, you're thinking about investment, that it is apparent and clear why and how they're being made. So I think transparency is probably one of the things that we've been coming at And I guess the more explicit environmental water planning is probably the other one that we're kind of focusing on in the way that we're doing it. But look, it's a negotiated agreement. And so in a lot of ways, the way that the process that I've just gone through and the way that we've ended up presenting sort of the outcome of all of that shows that it's an uplift from the last. If we don't have the same policy focus, those economic drivers that were certainly in that first NWI, I think it sort of shows the maturity of where we're at, is that we're just trying to kind of continue on. Remote and regional, of course, is a big focus which comes through the whole thing. But I think the other real tricky thing that I haven't talked about here, for certainly some people in the room who worked on this for a lot longer and be a lot more informed than I am, is that there's such different each state territory has such different places on their water journey, and so it's really around how can we not make the same mistakes as we might have done in some jurisdictions as we had in others, and level everyone out as much as possible, also respecting the fact that we are in such a different place and have such different shaping factors that it can't be the same for everyone.
Sorry, I just wanted to quickly clarify. In the microeconomic reforms, it was a negative incentive, not an incentive. So they were given money. Money was taken away that they were due to get. So that brought treasuries into the table. And that was a really critically important part of those purely microeconomic reforms, because you can't just do it from a water department perspective. There's not enough money on that bucket. But if you involve treasury in it through negative incentives, that there's going to be cuts in grants if you don't demonstrate progress against the National Water Agreement initiatives, then there may be cuts in grant funding in other areas, which had a big impact on how our reforms were introduced through the late 90s and the early 2000s and accelerated through Malone drought. So it's one of those things that I think we really need to think about how we incentivize people to actually engage in this and to do so in a meaningful way. Wishful thinking doesn't work anymore because we're all in really fiscally constrained markets.